breaking down barriers on mental illness and the challenges of bringing relief to millions in misery. What drives people to depression and suicide, and what's being done to help those affected? This is Inside Story. It's a condition fraught with myths and misunderstandings. The good news is that mental illness can be successfully treated, but can be. The problem is there are plenty of obstacles in the way. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. Welcome to this special edition of Inside Story on mental illness. The World Health Organization estimates that 1 in 4 people will suffer from some form of mental disorder in their lifetime. It's a condition affecting people of all ages. The WHO says up to 20% of children and teenagers are affected. And figures show that 1 million suicides every year around the world are related to mental illness. That's 1 suicide every 40 seconds. To our panel in a moment. But first, Linda Neuberg gets our discussion underway with a report from Stockholm in Sweden, a country which has for decades had one of the highest suicide rates in the world.
Håkan Wingren visits the psychiatric hospital in Lund to tell his story of coming close to suicide.
So I wrote a farewell letter, and then I went out in the garden and found a rope, and I was staying there with a rope in my hands, a warm, fantastic rope.
After a month in a mental hospital and 5 rounds of electric shock therapy, Wingren is well and serves as an attitude ambassador.
Jag heter Håkan Wingren och jag är attitydambassadör.
The 350 ambassadors aim to make Swedes aware of mental health issues among friends, neighbors and colleagues.
Is there some reason for me to think that maybe he's depressed, maybe I should ask him. Maybe I should actually tell him that I know where to go.
Suicide prevention campaigners continually update their tools, like this new first aid kit that has a questionnaire on mental health and a phone number where to call if you need help. This is all about raising awareness and breaking taboos on mental illness. The number of suicides has dropped steadily in all age groups, except young people. They have remained flat. Volunteers at a suicide internet hotline in Stockholm are chatting mainly to young people, trying to offer hope to the hopeless. This 19-year-old student found help here.
I was very upset. I actually was trying to find a way to commit suicide, but I realized that even if I'm not needed that night, that I will probably be needed tomorrow.
Sweden is leading the way in suicide prevention, proving that a coordinated, well-funded program can save lives, that people intent on killing themselves can be stopped.
And we'll be hearing from our correspondents in China and Haiti a little later. But joining me now are Dr. Ziad Kronfol, Professor of Psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College here in Doha, and Dr. Suhaila Gulum, Head of the Psychiatry Department at the Hamad Medical Corporation, also here in Doha. Dr. Kronfol, then, let's begin with this Scandinavian paradox. Countries which lead the world in terms of happiness, income inequality, and yet also lead the world in suicides. What does that tell us about the nature of mental health disorders?
Well, suicide, unlike what most people think, is not really the ultimate of being unhappy. When we look at suicide risk, there are a number of risks. For instance, being single, for instance, not belonging to a religion, like being an atheist, being recently separated or divorced, being unemployed. Happy or unhappy is not one of the risk factors.
There were, as far as the Scandinavian paradox there is concerned, there were at once, Dr. Gulum, theories that it was because of particular Scandinavian cultural traits or long winters, but now actually people are wondering whether it's actually because when people around you are doing well, that's actually when life can become unbearable if you yourself aren't doing very well.
That's quite true, actually. Well, I'd like to clarify first that the issue of higher suicide rates in Scandinavia it's been kind of debated. In a lot of studies, in the WHO report, for example, in fact, the rates of suicide in Scandinavian countries are not higher than in the US, for example. So it's not true that the rates of suicide there are significantly higher than elsewhere in the world.
But they do, I mean, there are league tables drawn up in which Scandinavian countries do take up many of the top spots.
They do, absolutely. They are, among the top spots, but they're not the highest. That's what I'm trying to say. They're not higher than the US, as an example. They're not higher than certain other countries worldwide, especially the more developed countries. And it's true that as the as the better that people around you do, if you're not doing well, then you're comparing yourself with others around you, of course. And just to confirm what Dr. Qurunful has said, the risk is not associated necessarily with financial well-being or happiness as such. There's biological depression. There is a genetic predisposition to depression that even people who are doing extremely well socially, financially, professionally, they still are exposed to suicide as a disease. And for those people, the risk of, to depression as a disease, and for those people, suicide risk would be higher.
And we'll return to that perhaps later in the program. But Dr. Qurunful, watching that story from Sweden, another striking part of it was that electroshock therapy is still widely being used. I think it's now called electroconvulsive therapy, I suppose. When I think many of us thought that was part of the bad old days of psychiatry.
It is still used worldwide because it is the most effective treatment when everything else fails. So it's not our first line of treatment. We try other things, and usually medication with psychotherapy, you work with 70–80% of the cases. But if you are among those 10 or 20% who did not respond to medication, electroconvulsive therapy is still very effective.
And what does it do exactly?
Nobody knows exactly what it does. It sort of, obviously, produce some changes in the biochemistry of the brain, cellular communication, circuitry, etc. I guess, perhaps the best example is to compare it to a computer. When you just reboot your computer when there's nothing else to do.
But so after all these years, we still don't know what this is.
Of course, this is. That's not a scientific explanation. Right. And there has been a lot of research being done on what electroconvulsive therapy does. There are certain hormones that are increased. There are some chemicals, that are changing in the brain, etc. But nobody knows exactly, what this particular conversion that you produce, where exactly does it work, how exactly does it do. All what we do is that it is effective and it's still being done. Now I have to mention that the technique has changed a lot over the years, so it's done under anesthesia. The patient doesn't feel anything at all. It only, the period of unconsciousness or sedation, it lasts maybe 10 minutes. The patient wakes up, and it's more often than not, the patients who have gotten help from ECT in the past, they are the people who would, ask you, when they definitely would rather have the treatment than continue to suffer with depression.
Well before that stage then, Dr. Gulen, what other treatments are we looking at? I mean, clearly, there's drugs, of course, right? But are there not concerns about that too? I mean, the assumption often is that we need more access to treatment, but there are also concerns that people are being over-medicated, and children in particular are being over-medicated when really they're just being children. So where's the balance lie there?
Well, medications are not. People are too scared of medication, and I think unnecessarily, to be honest. There isn't anything called an entirely safe medication with no side effects, of course. Everything has got side effects. So antidepressants, they exist. There's quite a large variety of them, in fact, and newer formulations are coming up that have less side effects, more tolerability.
But what about non-drug? I mean, cognitive behavioral therapy.
There are. So there's the medication aspect of intervention, and then there's the psychological intervention. Cognitive behavioral therapy is an example. There's a group of psychotherapeutic modalities, cognitive analytical therapy, psychoanalysis, which is still practiced in some places. These are all equally effective for certain degrees of depression.
But wouldn't those be more preferable to using pharmacological methods?
It depends on the level of depression. There are several levels. There's mild to moderate depression, for which cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, has been proven to be equally effective to medication. But for the more severe cases, people need medication, and CBT would have a role. but it's not going to replace the need for medication. So it depends on severity.
Very quickly.
There's something I'd like to mention here, is that people in general, when they think about mental illness and they think about treatment, they think a lot in terms of psychological versus biological. And I think this is a wrong approach, because the psychology and the biology are always, very much interfaced. For instance, there is a lot of research that shows that psychotherapy itself produces changes in the brain. So it's not like, you need the medications to change the chemistry. You can do the same thing with psychology.
So then surely that should be the first resort then?
Yeah, but the thing is, the psychology works much better when there's medication with it.
Okay.
So it's very much interrelated.
Right. Well, let's return now perhaps to that idea of the relationship between economic inequality and psychology. China is a country that's experienced rapid growth. It seems various mental health problems have come along with that growth. It's estimated that more than 30 million Chinese are being treated for depression, as Rob McBride reports now from Nanjing.
At a mental health facility in the city of Nanjing, staff and patients attend one of the daily exercise sessions. Along with counselling and drugs designed to treat stress and depression, these patients can count themselves lucky. For every one patient being treated here, it is estimated there are up to 20 others who should be. College student Lee has been here for 5 months.
Before I came into hospital, I was unable to communicate with anyone. I was in a terrible state and felt close to collapse emotionally. I thought about committing suicide.
As one of China's leading experts on stress, Professor Jiang Ning has seen an alarming rise in the number of patients suffering from work-related mental illness.
In the past 30 years, the opening up of China has been very rapid and people feel the pressure. It is unprecedented. And I've been paying a lot of attention to occupational burnout, which happens especially among white-collar workers and high achievers.
The development of China into a more competition-driven economy has resulted in the kinds of pressures until now associated with more developed societies. The pressures of the modern urban environment, it seems, are taking a toll, and as with so many other new challenges for China, the potential for growth is astounding. One report from Shanghai suggests more than 80% of depressed people are currently going untreated. And as China's smaller cities are reached by the same combination of urban pressure and a greater awareness of what stress is, the problem is likely to get bigger.
So that's rather interesting then, Dr. Gülüm, because from what you were saying earlier, there isn't necessarily this correlation between economic disparity and mental health. It is relatively evenly distributed, and yet we often hear this idea, though, that because of development and urban pressures, there is an increase in mental health. What is the truth then?
No, what I meant was that increasing financial prosperity is not associated with a positive mental health. In fact, it could be the opposite. So what you're saying is absolutely correct, and what the report has suggested. In industrialized countries, the incidence and the prevalence of mental illness generally tends to be higher. And that has a lot of factors. The stress, like they mentioned in the report, the work-related stress becomes much higher. Social factors, social connections between families, the nuclear family, moving away from the extended family and the support that this provides. These are all risk factors that contribute.
But I wonder whether the numbers that we have now do suggest that it isn't, that might not actually be the case. We have the World Health Organization World Health Survey on depression among adults, which says that in high-income countries, the level of depression is 7.1%. In so-called upper middle-income countries, it's 7.6%. And for those considered to fall into the lower middle-income category of countries, the figure is 6.4%, while in low-income nations, the rate of depression is estimated at 6%. So it does seem relatively evenly distributed between 6 and 7% then, Dr. Kronfeld. That perhaps it's a bit of a myth that there are these rural idylls, these undeveloped idylls where depression doesn't occur, and then there are these high-stress, developed cities there where you get depression.
To me, the figures seem to tell me, that the economy is not the crucial factor. So people get depressed not because of how much money they've got, or how or how much money they do not get. Stress is an important factor, and sometimes sometimes the same factor that produce people to achieve are also and make money can be also the same factor that push people to get depressed. Now, I'm talking about some biological risks. So like when you take risks, for instance, or if you have bipolar illness, there are times when you have excessive energy, you take on risk, you make a lot of fortune. But this particular disease is also associated with very deep depression and suicide. So sometimes it's the same factor that pushes you in both directions.
And according to a recent UN report, in fact, because of the population size in some of these low-income countries, the majority of mental disorders then are in low and middle-income areas of the world. So, of course, that will lead to other problems of how people are being treated, I suppose, then, Dr. Gulum.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the resources available would be affected. The access to care would be affected, depending on the level of income of the country. Depending also on the mental health awareness of the population, but also of the policymakers within each country, and to what extent they're willing to understand the impact of mental illness on the population, and how much they're willing to spend on preventive methods.
Something we haven't mentioned yet, though, is that women and young adults seem to be disproportionately affected by mental illness. Is there any particular reason, Dr. Kronfall, then why women in particular then are?
Well, women in general are more affected by depression than men. It probably there's some hormonal factors that play a role, and we are seeing more and more people getting depressed at a younger age. So there are now children who become depressed, and I think, as the report mentioned, there's an alarming rate of suicide among adolescents. In fact, in certain age group, between say 15 and 25 or 35, suicide is the third leading cause of death. Sometimes it's the first leading cause of death.
So is it clear why, though?
The other two are accident, and homicide.
Right.
It is a very major problem.
But is it clear why these particular groups, why young adults then are suffering so much? Then?
Well, the incidence of mental illness generally starts, or the onset, as in early adulthood, late adolescence. So this is the onset of illness. And for somebody with depression or schizophrenia, for example, to be aged 16 or 17 and diagnosed with a condition that they perceive as chronic illness, that's quite difficult to grasp and difficult to accept. When the understanding of what the prognosis is going to be like, or the worry about the future is higher, not being able to fit, the impact of the illness on their functioning at school, for example.
Is it increasing amongst young adults, or is it just that it's being reported more? Or, I mean,
I think it's an element of both, to be honest. It is increasing on the one hand, but it's also reported more. As awareness increases, of course, with that, reporting would increase.
Well, clearly there are many reasons why people suffer from mental illness. Trauma from natural disasters is another, as Kath Turner reports from Haiti, a country still recovering from a powerful earthquake, hurricane and floods.
Outside the mental health hospital, they wait and watch.
Jesus is stand for you.
It can take hours to see a doctor or nurse, and the line keeps getting longer. Another man is brought in, his hands and legs bound together, restrained in the back of a vehicle. He's virtually ignored for several minutes until someone notices he's thirsty. This is one of 2 psychiatric centres in Haiti, with a combined bed capacity of just over 300.
We're overwhelmed. There are not enough doctors for the patients. There are only 30 psychiatrists in the country, and 23 have a private practice. That leaves 7 psychiatrists for 10 million people.
Dr. Gerard let us film him on his daily rounds at the hospital. Inside are dozens of people in varying degrees of mental distress, locked up behind bars with few facilities and minimal supervision. The most common problems are delusional and bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, agitation, epilepsy and drug-related mental illnesses. Dr. Gerard says almost all of them are related to the earthquake. Most will go untreated.
I'm really worried and concerned because people come for help that sometimes we can't provide.
The earthquake displaced around 1.5 million Haitians. It's hard to get a handle on exact numbers, but based on its own research, the International Organization of Migrants estimates 70% of those people are in need of some kind of help from mental health services. Before the disaster, there was no mental health system. Most people thought being mentally ill meant you were crazy. The fallout from the earthquake forced the issue into the open, and some of the shame went away. But there's a long way to go. The government has allocated just 15% of its budget to health, and of that, only 3% is spent on mental health services. The other obstacle is cultural. Haitians often turn to religious and spiritual leaders, not medical professionals.
You only go to see a person of voodoo, and the person of voodoo don't have the capacity, and they don't have the skills in view to ensure the follow-up of this person with living with mental health issues.
The continued neglect of Haiti's mentally ill population is yet another challenge for a nation still haunted by one of the worst natural disasters in history.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Kronfol. I mean, in the aftermath of a natural disaster, clearly infectious diseases are often thought of as the most important thing to be sorted out. However, there does seem to be more recognition now that the psychological impact of tens of thousands of bodies can sometimes be more important perhaps than the effect on health.
Unfortunately, in most natural disasters, they are a culmination of all sorts of problems. You lose your family, you lose your house, you lose your job, and it's happening at a massive scale. So, of course, when somebody is injured, you see the wound. This is the first thing that you think about. But the mental problem, the anguish, you don't see it firsthand. It is there, but it's not your priority. It starts to appear and start to accumulate with time, because everybody who has lost a loved one or who has been affected directly or indirectly is going to suffer psychologically. And the resources, unfortunately, the countries where those natural disasters seem to happen seem also to have very limited resources. There is something called disaster psychiatry, which is like whenever there is a natural disaster or a war or something of that nature, it is known among us psychiatrists that these people need a lot of help, and there is some sort of a global humanitarian, agencies that go, to the rescue. And it's mostly done at the level of organization and volunteers, because again the very limited resources in this country have to go to the trauma, I mean the physical injury and infection, and as you mentioned.
But as we close this discussion, though, in the end, is there any obvious means of prevention of mental illness, of depression, of these things? I mean, it seems to be such a combination of factors that you've discussed over the last 25 minutes or so, but what would you suggest?
Well, ultimately, prevention should be the answer. And in many disorders that we have seen, infection and so on, prevention, and even heart disease, and hopefully one day cancer, we will be able to prevent these illnesses before they occur. The same thing should happen in psychiatry and in mental illness, but it's much more difficult to understand fully the brain. We're making very giant, leaps of progress. I think that once we have a better, I mean, for instance, genomic studies now would allow us to know a lot about mental illness and the brain that we didn't know before, and hopefully, and not in the very, not the very distant future, people would have access to information about which diseases they are at risk for, and if we know that somebody is at risk for depression or another mental illness, then all these stresses that contribute to this disorder from happening, might be alleviated, or you can, try to prevent this. So ultimately, yes, there will be, I hope there would be a sense of prevention, but we are not there yet.
Dr. Gulunder, there's a lot of questions about that sort of form of prevention based on the human genome there. I mean, a lot of people are quite frightened by that prospect as well there, right? I mean, it's not, there will be questions raised about prevention based on looking at our genetic makeup before we even start our lives.
We're not at that level yet, like Dr. Kronfol was saying. That's still in the future. But at the moment, when we talk nowadays, with the information that we have available so far, when we talk about prevention, we're talking about really improving the quality of life, avoiding the risk factors that we currently know of and are clearly established. Avoiding stressful factors, and how could people live a healthy living lifestyle, and how could they improve their coping mechanisms as prevention.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Suhaila Gulum and Dr. Ziad Kronefol. And you can add to this discussion online. Follow the links on the screen now. I'm Shihab Ratansi. From me and all of the team, goodbye.